Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to leave a minute for people to join us, and then we're going to get started. All right, I'm watching our attendee list climb. Okay, so just give it one more minute. It looks like we're still having an influx of people joining the Zoom, so I want to wait until everybody can get on. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I just want to say welcome to everyone. My name is Hillary Bunlert. I am the Administrative Officer for the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences, and on the leadership team for the Diversity and Inclusion Certificate Program Alumni Group. And this presentation today, which I'm really excited to share with you, is co-hosted by our Multicultural Resource Center and the Diversity and Inclusion Certificate Program Alumni Group. We have a working group called CICP 2.0, which is about continuing our learning and education after the certificate program. We've selected a theme for the first half of this academic year to focus on learning about anti-Blackness and its impact on us as a culture and as individuals. And we are really excited to share with you today's presentation. Right now, I just wanted to remind you all that this is a webinar, not a Zoom meeting. So the only people who will be enabled to speak will be the panelists. But you do have the Q&A function in your Zoom where you can pose questions for our speaker, and we'll be keeping track of that. And she can either answer those live, or we can have her type in answers to your questions as we go. And so I would encourage you, she's a very dynamic speaker. I would encourage you to post your questions there. I'm sure she's excited to hear from all of you. And so I'm just going to say that the title of today's talk is The Intersection of Race Inequity and Redlining. And I saw Dr. Wesley give this as a presentation for the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences about a month ago. And I immediately was like, I want to bring this to a larger audience and share it with more people. So I'm delighted that the entire UCSF community is able to participate today, and I know she's excited to talk to all of you. So just a quick introduction here about who Dr. Lawanda Wesley is. So she currently serves as Oakland Unified School District's Director of Quality Enhancement and Professional Development of Early Education, where she's supporting a dynamic cadre of more than 200 teachers and an early education leadership team. She also co-directs a statewide leadership fellowship that's called the California Consortium for Equity in Early Childhood Education Fellowship. She's co-founder and co-director for the Center for Equity in Early Childhood Education, which is all about disrupting race inequities at its root cause. And she is the co-author of the second book in a series about trauma called Culturally Responsive Self-Care for Early Childhood Educators. And she's also contributed recently to the California Department of Education's recently published document, Responsive Early Education for Young Children and Families Experiencing Homelessness. And Dr. Wesley trains on trauma responsive practices and healing in a highly specialized area for the Center for Optimal Brain Integration. So Dr. Wesley has a wealth of experience, and this is a really interesting presentation that I'm excited to have shared with you. So I am now going to turn things over to you, Dr. Wesley. Thank you for joining us.
Hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. You may be asking, what is an early education expert doing with medical experts like yourself? And I'm also questioning the same thing, except when we get through the presentation, it'll all make sense. And I'll just give a little bit of context. One of the first reasons why I started trying to figure out why my beautiful babies at 2 years old and 3 and 4 year old were coming to early learning settings called preschool are already, and I don't even like to use the word damage because it's such a deficit word, but just harmed or having low self-esteem or already received messages that their self-worth wasn't enough. And most of the children we serve in Oakland Unified School District, the majority are Latinx. The next largest population is Black / African American. Then we have our Chinese population, Vietnamese, and then our Muslim community and Pacific Islanders and First Native Americans. So we have a very diverse population at OUSD, but these kids weren't arriving, you know, just full of life and full of joy. So I was trying to figure out what is going on. And I went into this deep journey beyond just looking at trauma and looking at trauma from a race equity lens, but just what is going on. And so one of the things it led me to was looking at the intersection of race as it connects to redlining. And I was like, wait, what? Everybody has to know about this. So that's what I'm going to take you on the journey. Feel free to ask questions. If questions come up as I'm presenting, which I'm okay with, because I had tech issues this morning, someone will be able to read out the question and I'll try to address it. So any one of my co-hosts, feel free to just stop me. You guys know I'm easygoing and we'll try to answer it. So I'm going to advance this to our next slide. And so to honor my ancestors, it's really important to always honor those who have passed. And so when I do this presentation, I call out those who have gone, and there's many that have gone than those who are more recent before you, but I'm going to call out their names anyway. We have, Breonna Taylor, and she passed no knock warrant, sleeping while Black. We have Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging while Black. We have George Floyd, who passed while, you get so many different things, but basically shopping while Black. We have Tamir Rice playing while Black. He was 12 years old. We could go on. My sorority sister, who passed away, she passed away basically while driving her car. And it's just a tragedy. So that these are just folks who were doing ordinary things who pass while being in the skin that they are. So today's objective is that we're going to look at 3 areas: how to utilize this knowledge gained about redlining to increase patient and doctor relationship that centers equity, and I'll show an actual framework for how you could disrupt from a physician's point of view and a hospital point of view. And then we'll look at how we can create conditions for adopting race equity policies and practices, and then strengthen awareness about redlining from a trauma-informed lens to move towards more radical healing. And I'm sorry, I was remiss to say that my sorority sister was Sandra Bland, that passed away a couple of years ago. One of the things we do in race equity training is we try to look at creating, we used to say create a safe space, but we also want to really create a brave space. And there's certain conditions to create a brave space. And that is one that we're going to welcome multiple viewpoints. Although you won't be speaking today directly, and I love to have interactive conversation, that won't happen fully today, but there is going to be a point where you can interject your voice. And then we want to own our own intentions and impact. So you may say something to others just in your private or in this space that your intention was this, but the impact may have caused some level of harm or unintentional consequences. So we always say, even though your intention may come from a good-spirited place, it can still cause harm. And I like to even think some of those examples are, I just remember growing up, a lot of folks would say, wow, Lawanda, you're very articulate. And you would think that was a compliment, right? And then I was like, well, did he tell all people that they're articulate? But what was implied in there is that you're articulate to be someone who's of a Black African descent. So the intention was to give a compliment, but the impact could cause harm, even when it's something you're trying to do from a good space. And then we also want to recognize our own privileges. Every last one of us on this call today is coming with some type of privilege. So in this space, you know, I acknowledge my privilege that I was fortunate enough to pursue a doctorate and was able to, you know, receive a terminal degree with lots of hard work. But that does put me in a category that separates me from most, right? I can even say I'm privileged to be able to have children and reproduce children without any other reproductive support. So that's a privilege that I had to be able to give birth to 5 children, and so forth. So we all have some level of privilege. And then I also want us to create the brave space condition is to take risks, lean into discomfort. There's something that's called the zone of comforts, and one of them is that the zone of discomfort, meaning you're being pushed into the zone that you're really not quite comfortable, but when you're there, you're learning. There's also the other end of discomfort zone is the zone of comfort, which means you're kind of like plateau, you're status quo, you're not really like, I'm just gonna stay where I am. It's been working for me all this time, why push myself? And then there's something that's called the learning zone that's in the middle. And so sometimes we will teeter on both. And when you're teetering on both, that's actually a healthy space to be in. So, but I do want to start pushing us a little bit today to lean into discomfort, because there's something that you'll feel in your blood, that you'll feel in your heart, that might just a little bit. And so lean into that and say, why am I feeling that way and what's coming up? And then for some of us, like myself, that talk a lot, we ask that you step back, and just really think about what your voice looks like. And if you are someone who doesn't talk very much or engage very much, I'm going to try to ask you to step up a little bit. But because we're using the Q&A feature, and we may or may not use the chat, it'll look a little different than when we do this in person. So that's okay. So what I want to do is start with our intersections. And so one of the things we do to get us on common ground is to talk about our intersections. Earlier, I talked about a little bit about my privilege stance, being able to receive an advanced degree like many of you. And so that's a privileged stance. But I'm also going to talk about my intersections a little bit, and I'll model it for you that may not be advantageous for me. So my race potentially may not, or my age that I'm going to share may not, and I'm going to share my family status that may or may not. So I will start and model for you. So I am, yes, Dr. Lawanda Wesley. I present and identify as being a Black woman. And I am now age 50 as of June 7th. I'm a half century old. That comes with wisdom. That comes with some other stuff. My family background, I come from being in and out of foster care. My mother was challenged with just suffering with the use of alcohol, where she had a hard time raising all 7 of her children on a consistent basis. So therefore, her children, me included, were in and out of foster care. And so, and I'm also a person who initially failed 7th grade, 8th grade, and 9th grade because of truancy, because I wasn't attending school regularly and I was attending to my younger siblings. I'm going to invite you to use the Q&A chat box, and my co-hosts are going to read out slowly as this comes in. But I'm going to ask you to be vulnerable and share just three of your intersections. So you may be a physician, you may identify as having a particular language, or having a certain heritage, or your occupation or religion, or your immigration status. So just share 3, and then as they come in, we'll slowly read those out, and we can start now. And then as they come in, if any of my co-hosts can just start reading those out, that would give voice.
I don't see any yet.
Okay.
I would just encourage people. So we have one: woman, queer, agnostic, woman, Latina, psychologist, Black, cis-het woman, PhD, spent year living in a children's home due to my parents' mental illness. I identify as a Latina immigrant, English as a second language learner, and UCSF staff. I am Jewish, culturally queer, white, Eastern European, female, cis, Northern California, age 58, physician, immigrant, woman, gay, male, Filipino, heterosexual, cisgendered, Black female physician with children with MD and PhD from a single family home.
Yes.
Buddhist, gay, disabled. I present and identify as a white woman, Jewish, PSYD, female, immigrant, graduate degree, immigrant female from the Middle East, Black woman, Presbyterian, age 57, woman, sexual abuse survivor, bisexual. 1, I am Afro-Latina. 2, I am cisgender female. 3, I am a U.S. citizen.
Mm-hmm.
I am a mixed Mexican and Irish first-gen to college woman.
Yes.
Scientist, quote-unquote baby of a large family and bi.
Mm-hmm.
Hispanic immigrant, gay, engineer, MBA. Male, cis black grad student, hetero. Cis het white woman, 45 years old, admin. I identify as an Asian American woman, grew up in a low-income family in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco.
Yes.
70, nurse, white, female, Roman Catholic from a divorced family home. You want me to go on?
No, we'll stop there, not because the others are important, but what it exemplifies is that we have more like than different, whether how we identify by our gender, our sexual orientation, whether we came from means that weren't so great, or we came from means that were really great. This all shapes our worldview, and this is probably nothing new to you, but sometime to give visibility to it, we have to hear it and we have to see it. So I like to do this intersection piece because these are the things actually that sometimes divide us instead of uniting us. And so we need to be able to acknowledge where there's common ground in our intersections and of our identity, and then what's nuance. Growing up in foster care, and I also too come from a background of sexual abuse and things that should not have happened to a child, right? And somehow I'm still here before you, being resilient and strong and not letting my past define me. So I'm going to move on, but you guys get the point. There's another text that I use, I have it right by me, to help set the ground for having cross-racial dialogue, and it is this resource by Glenn Singleton called Courageous Conversation, and he likens it to a compass where we enter in from either a moral of like what's right, what's wrong, or we enter into race conversations from an intellectual, let me research that, I'm one of those, let me look that up, where is that in the literature, how does the research support that, and then I'm also one who will go into the social aspect to say, well, what's the lived experience? I know this is the research, but how does it play out in real life? Whether I turn to my own life or my own Black community, or we're looking at Indigenous community, or now I have 4 grandchildren, and two of them are now, not that they are now, they always have been, but their mother is Vietnamese and Cambodian, and my son is Black, and so now my grandchildren are mixed heritage, and their primary language is Vietnamese. So I was at their house the other day, and they were playing bingo, Vietnamese bingo, and I was so fascinated. And I wanted the kids who were playing to tell me all about it so I could learn to play that with my grandson and my granddaughter. And so anyway, it's just trying to constantly learn about not just the heritage that you sit in or the ethnicity and culture you sit in, but what does it look like from another standpoint? And of course, in early education, that just fascinated me. And then some of us enter cross-racial dialogue from an emotional stance, where it just tugs at our heart. Ibram X. Kendi, and I know some of you may be aware of this book, and I'll just hold it up really quick. Ibram X. Kendi talks about, there's a page, I think it's page 210, that talks about feeling advocacy. Some of us go out, such as when our brother George Floyd passed away, from an emotional lens, like this is not right, we need to do something about it. We watch genocide of a human being happen right in front of us, right? And so, but the feeling advocacy also means sometimes it's just that, we just do the Black Lives Matter, or we do our, social media kind of like releasing or demonstration, but when we return home, we don't, we go back to our comfortable lives, including myself, right? So, but we all lean in it from this way, from an emotional standpoint, moral, social, intellectual. None of it's right necessarily, none of it's wrong, it just is. But just to be aware today, where are you leaning in? Is it moral stance, intellectual, social, emotional, or a few of them? So just be mindful of that. I also want to present to you something that comes from the National Equity Project, and it looks at the 4 lenses of oppression. And you'll see here's individual, interpersonal, institutional, structural. I won't lecture on it too long, but from an individual level, it's talking about what are the beliefs and actions that I hold that might be perpetuating oppression. Just holding those beliefs and then acting on it can cause oppression, right? Whether it's conscious or unconscious, externalized or internalized. And then still at the individual level is something called the interpersonal. And that's when you and I, me and another person or a small group of folks get together and start to have conversation about race or inequities about race, and sometimes we might be perpetuating, sometimes jokes are said, right? Or there's feelings that we have about a certain group of people that might be taking away scarce resources, but we might be having these conversations, or how to disrupt it, how are we going to make the world better? But the individual level captures both individual and interpersonal. Then at the systemic level is what we call institutional, and institutional starts to look at the actual policies and practices in a particular organization. So in Oakland Unified School District, for example, we have restorative justice, and we had to do that because we were sued in 2010 for disproportionate exposure rates of Black and brown children. And so they had to put in something that would mitigate that. And so that's how at the institutional level, you have an issue, but then you can address it. And then structural, what happens from one institution to the next institution to the next institution. So that could be our federal government, when you think about the DACA and the Dreamers, when you think about the Affordable Health Care Act, making sure that folks have access to healthcare supports and resources. Those are structurals. But if you bump up against those systems constantly, what happens is if I'm an individual trying to access support and resources, and then we're talking about housing, then you find that that's where despair, that's where hopelessness sets in. If it's disproportionately upon a particular group of people of color, then you see that there's issues, and that feeds into our conversation we're going to have about redlining. One of the things I like to do quickly is try to pull folks into a little bit of history, but there's this concept around called the doctrine of discovery, and this goes all the way back to Columbus in the late 1400s. And what happened is Columbus set out to sail and purposely find basically human beings that could be exploited and enslaved. And when he did his 4 voyages, he took copious notes to how to get there. He took copious notes when he got to a particular continent and studied how they moved, how they act, how they interacted with one another. Looked at how they just moved about on their land, and then decided how he would go in with a group of other folks to kind of conquer, right, and place them into slavery. And so they did this first with our first Native folks, who were indigenous to North America and to Canada, and then took over 100 million of Native people. And he did that in Australia, and they also did that, obviously, going to the continent of Africa and specific countries in Africa and doing the same. So we call this the doctrine of discovery, even though he wasn't the first to discover the US or North America. The other thing is that we want to put into a framework as the construct of race. This is probably one of the most fascinating pieces of my presentation that people go, oh my gosh, but it's something called the OIDS. And this came out of early neuroscience, and the early neuroscience, coming from a European lens, said that we will look at the size of your brain matter and the size of your skull. Using an instrument, we will measure this. And based upon the size of your brain matter and brain skull, the larger, is a measure of intelligence. And so it's also the foundation of eugenicists who looked at standardized testing. But to keep it focused here, they decided from a European lens, we are European, our brains are larger, we will name ourselves the Caucasoids. And they moved on and named those from Asian descent, Mongoloids. Australoids were considered like the bush people, so to speak, or the red people. And then the Capoids were like our Native Americans, and then Negroids became those of us who are now identified as Black or African American. And so this whole construct around race is false. It doesn't exist. It's made up. It's not, there's no foundation in biology that says there's a difference between us because of the melanin in our skin. And so we know that that isn't the truth, but yet we function and built an entire society off of it. Just to take you into a little bit more history, there's something called the 3/5 compromise, when there was the Civil War, and then the southern states and the northern states. The southern states were trying to hold on to their enslaved Africans and wanted to count them in their population so they could have have dominion and power. And if you look over on the other side, the northern states are like, no, you can't count your enslaved Africans in the population, but we'll allow you to tax them. And then back on the southern side, they're like, no, you're not going to tax them because they're property. So you can see this dichotomy and complexity of like trying to count these enslaved human beings in one sense as being a part of being able to vote, and those who were not able to vote. And I'll show you a quick diagram that looks at that. So if you look at the top left, if you were a free person or European deemed as a Caucasoid or Caucasian, each vote counted for a vote. One vote equals a vote. But then if you look on the other side to the far right, you'll see there in the yellow, enslaved Africans could not vote. However, the 3/5 compromise at the bottom says, well, 5 citizens, 5 votes. But what we'll do on the far right under the 3/5 compromise is say that for every 5 slaves, the votes will count for 3 free slaves. And you'll hear some Black folks will say, we're only 3/5 human. And this is where that came from. And this is still in the Constitution today and is now the basis of our electoral college. And that's how we have representation. And that's why you'll hear people want to disrupt the electoral college, because it was based on falsehood of the false notion around race construct. So what I'm going to do, and I know that I don't know if anyone can unmute themselves, but I like to have us as a community share out our voice. If it's possible, if one person can be unmuted from the community to read this definition that I'm transitioning to redlining, what redlining is, keeping that background about race construct. So if someone could read the Cambridge Dictionary, and that would be great.
We'll take a volunteer. Just put your name in the Q&A section, and then I will unmute you from the list of attendees.
Perfect.
So anybody who wants to volunteer, I have Kathleen Umel. I'm going to go to her in the panelist and put her on speaking. Hold on.
Okay.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Sorry.
We can.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So definition of redlining: the practice of refusing to lend money, give mortgages, or sell home insurance to people living in poor areas, or charging them high rates for this.
So thank you so much for putting your voice in the space. So that's the Cambridge Dictionary. And now we're going to go to the definition. Somebody new can read this: Corporate Finance Institute definition. And then if we don't have a volunteer, someone can just read it. That's a co-host.
I can read it if you want me to keep going.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Oh,
So
no,
corporate finance.
we have another volunteer.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to bring on Melinda Bell.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Corporate Finance Institute: the systematic denial of services to residents of certain neighborhoods or communities associated with a certain racial or ethnic group.
So this is the foundation of systematic denial of where one can live. So thank you for reading that. And it was then based on a particular group of people based upon your race. And so what I'm going to do really quickly is show you I think it's a 4-minute clip that does a really good job of like explaining what that looked like in real life. So I'm going to play the clip. If there's a reason why it can't be heard, my co-host has a backup plan to play it from their end. So but we're going to give it a go.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak. It was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences. Very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
It was as though it wasn't real. You can't imagine. But for someone to come out and actually tell you that they can't sell to you. You know, I was really on an up. Man, look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin, I can't be a part of it.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something definitely wrong there.
So, as you can see, after World War II, what happened to those who weren't able to secure housing, they were basically forced to be in certain communities. But what I want to do is give pause, because this can be such an emotional piece, piece of the presentation. Just what is coming up for you as you see this piece, and you can put it in the Q&A part of this presentation, like seeing that video and hearing what that family, that couple experienced and the practice of redlining.
Somebody has put in that it's devastating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Someone else
Yeah.
says anger and frustration.
Yeah.
Anger and frustration, horrified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those were
Deplorable. Sorry.
no, it's okay.
Deplorable and shameful. Redlining is an evil system. Fear and hopelessness. Funny that people are just finding out. Sadness, heartbreak, and shame. Why isn't this taught? Somebody said intentional and malicious. And somebody else has written, I'm leading a collaboratory on COVID-19 and race ethnic disparities with students from across the country. I think my students should hear this. They will feel the anger and outrage. We would like to invite Dr. Wesley to speak to our scholars. So she's giving you her contact information. We'll put you in touch.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yes.
Generational trauma. I feel betrayal, anger, and intimidation. The video made me think of all the times my African-American family couldn't get loans, even if they had good credit. It's blatant structural racism and disgusting. I feel disbelief. It's unjust. I feel anger. Shocked that I was unaware of the extent. This sad injustice is so blatantly obvious, and yet it still lives on. I want to learn more. It is so sad, especially after serving in the military, to face that kind of discrimination when he might have expected to finally experience acceptance. I can see why Black folks would feel gaslit. Angry, gave a lot of understanding when I saw that clip years ago, and a motivation to make change. More evidence that reparations need to be seriously discussed. I've had to look away because honestly, it's traumatic just thinking about what we've survived. It's hideous. This results in generations of lower income and poverty. It's baked into society, and it's overwhelming and fills me with anguish.
Yep.
It's still relevant today. Now our neighborhoods are being gentrified. It's unjust.
Yeah. All your comments are like spot on. Not one wasn't spot on. And I'm gonna hopefully leave you with some hope, because we can't stay in despair, because we got work to do. This is what I was trying to figure out with our Black and brown babies. Like, they are 24 months into their life, 36 months into their life, 48 months into their life, and they're already, their spirit is already harmed, the inner spirit of their humanness. And I couldn't figure out why this was. And then I was raised in Oakland as well, and grew up in poverty and all the yucky things, right? And I was like, this is like fixed. But we can do something about it. So hopefully I'll get you guys there. I don't want to leave you there, because this is a great time in our history where we can rise up together as white brothers and sisters, Asian brothers and sisters, Muslim brothers and sisters, Black brothers and sisters. We were all duped. When you look at the construct of race, whether you're on the hierarchy end of being superior, so-called superior, or at the lower end of this false narrative of being, inferior, we were all told a bunch of lies based on a falsehood to create who could be in power, who could be not, who would be enslaved and forced labor. It's all a hot mess, right? To be honest, just to put it plainly. I'm going to take us back to redlining. Thanks for putting your voice in the space. One of the things they did is they did something called residential security map, and this was done by the appraisers and the real estate brokers and agents. And so what they would do is look at, when you saw the letter grading, here's the letter grading. Here's an example of a legend that they used to say what neighborhood was an A list, a B list, C, and D. And you see the color coding that goes with it. And D is given the worst and the most hazardous. And you'll see in a minute that actually means there were people of color living there that they didn't want there. Here's another residential security legion map that they used from 1937. And it goes a little bit further than the ABCD. You'll see they'll look at like industrial, commercial, and then areas that were still underdeveloped or considered farmland. So that was also used to try to assess what was going on. Here is a redlining map from the Oakland, Berkeley, Bay Area community, and you'll see clearly right here the red, the yellow, the blue, and the green. which is astonishing to me, like that I could find this. Because when I said I was finding out, when I stayed up for 2 days, I stayed up for 2 or 3 days doing this. And I was like, everybody needs to know about this in case they don't, but maybe it's just me. I don't know. So this is what I came across, and I was astonished. But what astonished me even more was that when you look at redlining from that period to this period, it doesn't change very much. You'll see there's, you look at Moraga to the far right, like the canyons and Moraga, that's on the green side. Orinda, that's on the red side. And if you start to go in towards like Emeryville, you'll see the red, you'll see Oakland in that area, so forth and so forth. I'm going to show another comparison map. Hope you can see it. It's really hard, but you'll see it side by side, and you'll see like how much has really changed. So when we say the systems are designed to do what it's doing, these are examples of what I mean. Systems of oppression, systems of racism. It's functioning the way it was supposed to. When you start talking about taxation of schools based on property, the Ryan tax in the, I think, mid-1970s got overturned because some folks said, I don't want to be paying for other folks' kids to go to school, and I'm taxed on it. My kids live in this neighborhood. Why are my taxes going to this neighborhood over here? So what happened in California, at least, that we got rid of it, and then funding of schools are only based on the property tax of those who live in that community. So if you're in a community that's already impoverished and it's considered a low income or low socioeconomic, you can't get out of it, right? It's constantly perpetuated. So your schools only a resource based on those property taxes, and if not much taxes are coming into that community, there's how it's perpetuated.
Lawanda, you had a comment from someone in the Q&A.
Okay.
She said that as a pediatrician, she shares your observation. Consistently, I could see a change in my little patients at around 6 to 8 years old when they seem to lose their enthusiasm for life and learning. Especially disheartening was the lack of enthusiasm for doing well in school. Very different from my patients from privileged families. It didn't matter how alert, intellectually bright, and or well-developed the children were.
Yeah, exactly. So I love that. So all of us are, well, not all of us, most of you are physicians or coming from the medical community, but you can see that even from the industry of education, your industry and profession of medicine, how they show up in our spaces, you know, I hate saying that deficit, but the harm or the lack of enthusiasm or optimism, right? And I felt that as a Black child. I knew early on that this beautiful brown skin that was called Black, that something was wrong. Something was wrong to people, but I didn't know why, because I wasn't a bad person in my little heart, right? But, you know, as you grow up, you learn your innocence is kind of blown away from that. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to show you just really quickly some of the language that was used in redlining. So for green, and you can't really see this, and I hope I don't blow this trying to show this to you, but I'm going to try to read, and I have my vision is not good. But in the video, they showed some of this, and so here is a map in the city of Oakland. And what it says is that in the clarifying remarks, it says considerable FHA financing in this area. Rents are lower in proportion to market price because of small rental demand and the availability of long-term loans, which enable house ownership cheaper than a fair ordinary rent. Little rental activity as houses are mostly owner occupied. This area would be called high green, but for above detrimental influences. This area is known as Montclair. And if you know anything history of Oakland, Montclair and Piedmont still is in the bubble, even though they're in Oakland, they pretend they're not. I think they pretend they're not, but that's just I'm adding extra to that, you guys. So that's just my feeling. And so what you'll see in 5D, is it 5D? Yeah. It said, are there Negroes present? No. So this made it a green community, right? So let's go to the next one. Hopefully I can advance over. Go back.
While she's advancing, I'll just, I'm going to share in the Q&A, somebody's given you a link where you can search and view the HOLC redline maps across the US and zoom in to see the overlaid maps. So I'm going to put that in the Q&A now for anyone who wants to look at it.
Okay, Rockstar, love you guys. See, we're learning together. I definitely don't know all the answers, but thank you for sharing that. Here's a blue community, and I'm going to read over here to the left. It says Negroes no, foreign-born folks on 5C, no, I think it says no, and then it says infiltration of undesirables. They call this undesirables, you guys. Undesirables, they said no, or they said they're remote. And so the language in here on the clarifying remarks, it says this area is generally known as Rock Ridge. It is difficult to prognosticate the future trend of the southern and southern-western arms of this area. The future of the southern extension will probably be determined by the future development of the adjacent undeveloped area, which for the sake of conservatism has been hash blue. The southwest portion will probably trend upward for some years and then follow the very old but respectable C10 area into gradual decline. So when they start talking about gradual decline, it starts talking about we think there might be infiltration of, those people of color. So I'm going to try to advance, see if I can do this, advance to the yellow. So for yellow, to the far left, under 5C, it says, are there foreign-born folks here? They're like, yeah. And I'm going to use this term. Know that it's not coming from me. I'm just reading it from this description of this particular property. And it's in this neighborhood. It's at foreign-born. They use the word Oriental, which we now know represent our Asian community, which then the Asian community can be broken down into other ethnic and cultural groups. And anyway, they say, hey, they're coming. And then when they talked about if there's Negroes present, they said there were 2 families present. So based on that, you get these clarifying remarks. They said a large part of the extensive area is known as the Blake Tract and is traversed by 2 main arteries of the city, which are zoned for business. These constitute a detrimental influence insofar as single-family residents and concern, while part of the area contain fairly desirable residencies, which are all maintained. Generally speaking, this area is made up of older houses, largely outmoded, I think, and fairly maintained. At the time of the infiltration survey, so they did an infiltration survey, y'all. They said in Berkeley in 1935, there were within the area 12 Oriental, meaning our beautiful Asian brothers and sisters, and 2 Negro families, meaning our Black brothers and sisters. These, however, were above the average of their races and were probably attracted to the district on account of its nearness to I think it's at the university. So when they said, basically they were saying the folks who were of Asian and Black descent, most likely we were exceptional Asian folks, exceptional Black folks. Maybe we were of some means for the times, and so that's what allowed us to move into the yellow zone. Otherwise, we probably would have been in the red zone, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to get to the last one, which is the
Lawanda,
red.
I'm just going to chime in. You have a comment from Carol Miller. She says, interestingly, the same concepts you're discussing can be applied to modern-day gentrification, which some have defined as a more acceptable term for redlining.
Amen. Take you guys to church. Yes, exactly. So they have, yes, I love this community. You guys are hot. Exactly. So they call it gentrification now, right? And then they say that we're doing it in the spirit of renovating or renovating the community or upgrading the community, and we'll make it a mixed resident, which we would welcome that, right? But if you're making a mixed residence, you don't displace by increasing the cost of property, either by purchase, whether you purchase property or rent property. So again, it's all designed to create that suburban kind of community, or a community that has only certain type of people in it by race. And then this last one on red, thank you for interjecting your voice, says spotted area. Occasionally there are several blocks which are practically free of color or Orientals. Remember, those are Asian brothers and sisters. But on the other hand, certain blocks of the area are nearly 100% Negro, Black folks, and constantly spreading. Population is increasing due to crowding of lower income families, zoned for light industrial. So red zone also bumped against that industrial on the security map. So no restriction as the type of residencies to live here. And so they said, yeah, there's infiltration of Black folks and Asian folks, and there are Black people, there are Black families, and there's 15. So this is all the systematic design. And so what I need to do quickly, because we don't have much time, oh my gosh, is you can't see this, but I know that some of you know this about the adverse childhood experience, a study that shows part of the communities that we come from can be perpetuated by children who live in these communities that are filled with poverty. And adverse childhood experiences look at 10 areas, and it breaks them down into 10 categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Well, whether that abuse is like physical abuse, emotional, or sexual, or the neglect is physical or emotional, or the household function is like maternal depression, we could go on. Family members who are being incarcerated, what it can lead to, and I hope I can enlarge this a little bit, what it can lead to is risk factors that you all are well of, more than me, related to more likeliness to engage in alcoholism, to become an alcoholic, or to smoke, or obesity, suicide, diabetes, we could like go on, COPD, heart disease, everything that you are much more versed in this early educator is. But this is then sets our young children, if they have 3 or more adverse childhood experiences from the top right-hand corner under the abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction, the more likely you are to have your life expectancy cut, right? And so what I'm going to do really quickly, I'm going to show, let me get rid of this, hi panel. I'm going to show a quick video, goodness, we don't have enough time, that really talks about what historical trauma looks like. And it comes from a psychologist by the name of Joy DeGruy, and it's a quick video that kind of explains it. And then I'm going to show you just really quickly disparity of like funding for schools that are you can see pretty clearly out through the Jim Crow period. You know, for every white student, there was $7 for a student in Alabama, Georgia, 32 for 7. This is just a way to show you how the funding for our schools got to be the way that it was. Not necessarily starting in Jim Crow, but it was justified during the Jim Crow era. So I'm going to show Joy DeCruz's video, If All Things Work.
And did you want to answer a couple of questions in the Q&A real quick?
Oh yes, let me do that. Let me do that.
Start the video.
That really looks.
I just wanted to give you a chance to answer the questions that people have posted. So one person asked, are the policies in the making to address the implication of redlining on minorities' socioeconomic status? So are there currently any policies in the making around fixing this?
I'm not aware of any federal policies. There are lots of like local communities trying to address it, like Urban Strategy. Well, nationally, I'll take that back. Urban Strategies is an organization that is trying to address this. I know there's another organization called the Poor People's Campaign. You might probably are familiar with it, with the uprising of the civil unrest recently. They're trying to do things on a national level, but really try to get at it at a local level. But if you go to organization, Urban Strategies is in the backyard in San Francisco too, by the way, and I believe they're also housed in Atlanta. And then my former husband works for Urban Strategies here in Sacramento, and is housed at the Sacramento Urban League. So you do have some civil rights organizations that are trying to address it. Yeah, those are great questions.
And then one more quick question. Raquel Rodriguez is curious to know if this or something similar existed or exists in European countries reflecting global and international oppression.
You know, I'm not as savvy on it, and I don't know if there's the larger organizations like the World Health Organization that might be looking at it, you know, because housing does lead to our physical, mental, and spiritual health well-being, right? So they may be looking at that from a global stance. But I'm not, you know, that's something I need to learn more about. I don't know. Now you're going to sit me on an adventure. So I don't know. But I hope so. I hope so.
And there were just a few comments in here. Somebody says resources also follow these boundaries. Red line districts are terribly under-resourced versus the other colors. Another person is, thank you for presenting the history of redlining in our Bay Area neighborhoods. She's moved here from the South and noticed that people who live in the Bay don't believe or see there is racism and racist policies here too.
Yeah, we're just nice about it.
Yeah, it's a different face, right? And then someone else has said, if race is a social contract historically, why is the narrative placed on Black people where they are considered unworthy in areas of economics, education, and law?
Because when African American, well, when enslaved Africans were so-called free by the Emancipation Proclamation, what they did is they still wanted that free labor, especially the South. So the South now wasn't able to build up their wealth and capitalism. And so what they did is created what they call, you can look this up, called Black Codes. There's two texts that really start to address that. One is called by Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote How to Be Anti-Racist. And then there's another book, and it is Richard Rosenstein, that's out of UC Berkeley. He wrote The Color of Law. I know you guys don't have time for this because you're physicians and you're so busy working from morning to noon, but these are the kind of resources I look at to try to understand that. But Black Code laws, basically, they gave you travel papers, and if you were caught without your travel papers as a free slave, they would say, no, you didn't have your travel papers, or if you just lost them, we're now going to penalize you, put you into jail, incarcerate you. When we incarcerate you, we then can ship you back out to the farmland into forced labor. That was one of your punishments, right? So that's why you still sort of have, I don't know if I answered the question, sort of have what you have still to this day. And Michelle Alexander, and I have my book here somewhere, Michelle Alexander talks about the new Jim Crow. Mass incarceration is just a replacement under the so-called what was going to be the Reconstruction that never really came for Black folks fully, of us still having to live. They just wanted us as free labor when they couldn't get it from First Native, Indigenous, Native Americans, and from Indigenous Africans. They said, we'll fix you. This is what we'll do. And you still have that legacy playing out to the present day, right? Sadly. I feel like I know I'm at time. I had to show you guys.
I know, I'm just going to pause and say it's 1 o'clock, and I know some people will have to sign off. I want to reassure those who do need to go right now that we are recording this session, and we'll make it available for folks to watch whatever they missed. But I want Dr. Wesley to finish her presentation out for those of us who can stay. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we'll have just 10 minutes left if you're able to stay. But this next video is so powerful. It'll probably change your life. It changed mine. So I'm going to show Joy DeGruy, who talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome and what it looks like. And I'll try to restart it at the beginning.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes. So 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. So I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a Black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course. There's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, you know, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. Ptsd is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. You know, all of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were, you know, African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, you know, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You socialize. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
Still with us, but I would like to just allow
post-traumatic slave syndrome
express
is an
advance with that, how that resonated for them, just one or two, and then I'm going to finish the presentation.
If anybody'd like to put their name in the Q&A, I'll unmute you to talk if you'd like to share.
Sure.
Oriole, did you want to say something live?
Okay. If not, it's okay. What I would like to do is then just talk about another, Sean Genwright, who's also in the Bay Area, out of Oakland, San Francisco area, talks about, I believe this was just published, I believe in the Los Angeles Times, talking about persistent traumatic stress environment. So what happens when you continually are oppressed or marginalized through the act of racism, and that it's not even post-traumatic, that it's persistent and it stays with us. And so unless we start to look at how we can start to look at healing through social justice approaches like Dr. Joy DeGruy talked about, then we can start getting to a better place in dealing with this this pandemic. And this has come from an educational lens, but he also talks about it from a financial standpoint. And then just a little bit, a lot of times since the uprising, we've been talking about how angry people have been and how we're basically impacting our neighborhoods in violent, in harsh ways because of the demonstrations and so forth. But a lot of that really is starting to talk about like all the anger that has faced people of color. Definitely particularly those who are Black, but all of us who just have, all of us who are either indigenous or just dealing with different levels of oppression because of the skin we're in or the language that we speak or the region of the world that we come from. And you'll see in this iceberg sort of model about what's really what you see some, exemplified is the anger and aggression. But really what's happening underneath the feeling of being scared or grief or embarrassed or helplessness or being worried or offended, it comes out in the form of aggression. So a lot of times we have to go beneath what we're seeing to really start to understand that and unpack that. And so what I wanted to leave you today with for your own, in the field of medicine and health, is the Institute for Healthcare Improvement has come up with an instrument. I just like, oh my gosh, I don't know if this is the right one, but I think it'll put you on a path to think about other instruments if this isn't the right one. But it's a race equity assessment tool that will help you try to think about why does it matter for us to disrupt this. And what you'll see is this quick definition says health equity may be a new term for some. It refers to a state where everyone has an opportunity to attain their full health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from that opportunity by their social circumstances. Going back, that race is a social construct. So your social circumstances shouldn't be a determinant of your health outcomes. And they give us these 5, that instrument provides these 5 areas that you can use to assess your health organization. And you'll see is making health equity a strategic priority, develop structure and processes to support health equity work, deploy specific strategies to address the multiple determinants of health on which healthcare organizations can have a direct impact. And they give some evidence to that to the right. Decrease institutional racism within the organization, and then develop partnerships with community organizations or community-based organizations. But I wanted to show you a little exemplar of the tool. It is divided into categories, and one of the categories is make health equity a strategic priority. And you can see on level 1 that it is not a priority. There's no strategic plan. If you go to the far right, it talks about creating a strategic plan, and it's built into the operation of that healthcare organization. And there is sustainable funding, because you only fund what you care about, right? So there's sustainable funding to help address the health equity area. Then you'll see the next one says develop a structure and processes to support health equity work. And so I'm going to send this tool to the host today so that you can have that. And if that tool isn't, again, the right one for you, it hopefully will put you on a path to finding one that you could use and implement into your setting. What that tool does, this specific tool that I shared, it just easily says, what are we trying to aim and accomplish? How will we know that a change has improved? So what's our metrics for measuring that? And then what changes can we make that will result in an improvement of ideas, and then testing out those ideas through this notion around act, plan, do, study, and do. So just going through that study, that cycle of implementing an idea to see what lands for you. And then I just want to leave you with a sense of hope. Hope is a gift you don't have to surrender, a power you don't have to throw away. And though hope can be an act for defiance, defiance isn't enough reason to hope, but there are good reasons. And so I wanted just to let you know there's something called the hope theory that looks at goal, agency, and pathway, and what that is meant, just really briefly. And I'll just take you here actually, is that goal meaning that you have your intentions on disrupting, in my sense, when I reframed it, looking at disrupting anti-racism, right? Just really taking that anti-racist stance, not interrupting, but taking a stance and being anti-racist. And then agency in the hope theory is how do we do that as a collective? You can do that through UCSF. And then pathways and strategies. And that kind of goes back to that assessment tool. You have to have clear strategies that you're going to do it, including funding it in an adequate way. And then just moving to the back to Sean Genright's work, he says you can't really get to healing if we're not going to remove the barriers that will get us to wellness and being transformative, so that there are no more sources of harm. And so it's no sense to look at racism, know what it is, and then turn people back to it. That will actually be re-traumatizing. So what we want to do is start thinking about radical self-care. There is someone that I'm reading. Her name is Joy Lewis, Joylewis, and she talks about radical self-care. And these are some of the components, because if you're going to do get into anti-racist work, it is exhausting. It's not a one-off. It's not just a hashtag. It's just a lot of work. So want to make sure that you have a sense of what that is, and that we need each other in this work. We need our white brothers and sisters in this work, our Muslim brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters, our Black brothers and sisters, like all of us, our First Native brothers and sisters, and everybody in between that I may have missed. We need all of us, our Latinx brothers and sisters. We need all of us in this work. And that if you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so. You can usually find me by text on the phone, because I work for Oakland Unified School District and we're going through reopening, so it's really intense. But if you send me a quick text using my phone number, I'll do my best to get back at you. But I also have my personal email here for you. And I went through that really fast because I'm well over time, but that concludes the presentation, and I hope it's a support to you, a blessing to you. Yes.
Are you willing to take a couple of questions that came up in the Q&A?
I am.
All right. So we have a participant called Chase Webb who had a question for you. So Chase, I've enabled you to talk if you want to give us your question.
Hi, Dr. Lawanda. Dr. Wesley, amazing presentation. I think all of UCSF needs to see this. But my question for you is, how do you, earlier you were talking about, sorry, I kind of forgot because I formulated my question like 20 minutes ago. But I was trying to ask you, like, how can we talk to our white colleagues about some of these issues? Because I feel like some of our white colleagues, they feel like just like, I don't know, like it's like super uncomfortable for them to engage. And do you have any advice for?
I do. I have a little bit of starting. They, just like people of color, sometimes we need our own space to talk about things that are like relevant to us. Like within our Black community, we talk about this notion around Black tax, right? But it would be hard for us to talk about Black tax and having to work twice as hard or 3 times as hard to be equivalent to our white peers, or equitable to our white peers. Our white brothers and sisters also need their own what we call affinity groups, where they can talk with one another plainly without being judged by people of color, and for people of color having to hold that burden, because we have our own emotional, psychological pain. So sometimes when they're trying to process with us because they're using us as a resource, which makes sense, right? But it's hard for us to do it because we get upset, we get angry, it's re-traumatizing, we cry, we want to scream, why don't you understand this? They need their own affinity group. And I listen within the school district and in other, and it doesn't even matter if it's in the school system, you need your own affinity group. So in Oakland, we have a Black affinity group, Latinx affinity group, we have a white affinity group. And there's books like White Fragility that helps. There's another book that's called Me and My White Supremacy, understanding that you may not actively try to perpetuate white supremacy, but by default of this silliness called this race construct, they inherited this privilege because of the hierarchy system that was developed well into, beginning of the 1400s, to be honest. And so that's what you need. Can you have affinity circles and then start to bring those affinity groups together to have cross dialogue? And you need someone who that is very versed and skilled at bringing groups together. But they can lead, they can be co-leaders of their own. Two people in each affinity group can lead that using an article, using a resource book to do that work. And that requires being willing to want to, turn the mirror back at ourselves and be reflective. So it can be hard. Like I said, that those zones of being in discomfort, comfort, and then the learning zone, that's where they're going to be toggling through in those affinity groups.
I see. And do you think that there's any potential, I think that you're right, that some people, maybe groups should it kind of seems like segregation in some way. And to me, it's like, if you have a group of all white people talking to each other, how do you know that they're getting the right message and they're not just making a safe space to kind of.
Yeah, if you look at Robin DiAngelo's book on white fragility, she's white and she's pretty straightforward. She doesn't sugarcoat it. And then Me and My White Supremacy, I think, is more action oriented. If they use those tools, I'm doing a book study for my sorority sisters right now, but these tools help guide us. So it takes us out of avoiding it. And if you're reading chapter to chapter, cover to cover, and the way you create your facilitation, I hate to say protocol, that will help them. Now, what you could do is something like this today, that's just a kickoff. This is, what I'm doing is simply a kickoff, a way to raise awareness. You could do something like this and then have them go into their groups. But we as people of color can't necessarily hold them so-called accountable, no more than they can try to hold us so-called accountable for our own feelings. And then you want to find someone who can facilitate then having these cross racial dialogues, but you might need one person that holds it for both, for all the affinity groups that might be created, that could toggle from all the communities to see what's being streamlined. That could be a strategic approach to that. Is there one person that is that can be neutral in supporting all affinity groups? That's a lot of work, right? Or a number of people who are in all affinity groups that could then, the leads of those affinity groups come together and talk about the similarities of what they're seeing and hearing from that constituent group. There's a couple ways to design around it. Hopefully that's helpful. So, okay, are we still, did anyone else have a question? Thank you, those are great questions.
So Nancy Rios says that there are lots of similar facts to apply to the Latino persistent stress disorder. So clearly, that those intersections are real for all of these groups. Adrienne says post-traumatic slave syndrome. As a teacher, I have seen parents of color denigrate their children despite their pride time and time again. I've done it for my own children. My parents have done it to me. I never understood why we speak about our kids in that way.
Yeah. And you got to think, I think even sometime I think about corporal punishment, from a child development stance, how we sometimes still engage in corporal punishment with our kids, but where did we learn that? Corporal punishment came from the slave master, the whipping and the beating for compliance and obedience. And then when we want to get children so-called into shape and being compliant, we do the same thing. I know I can only speak of that within the African-American community. I think we're starting to move away from it, but there's some old-fashioned values about that that's even sometimes even justified by using biblical principles. And I'm a Christian, and I've heard it, spare the rod, spoil a child, right? And he's like, oh God, I heard that forever. And then I was like, is there not a way to talk to children and have, still help them understand consequences that doesn't, your first thing is not to, engage in corporal punishment by physical contact with children. And it just makes them hurt inside and harm inside, right? So.
You also have a comment from Eli Jimenez saying, thank you for dropping so much knowledge. And shout out to the Black Organizing Project and the community in Oakland for eliminating police in the Oakland School District.
Yeah, we did. We did. We're not favorites right now, but we did. We want to replace it with programs.
Right. Somebody has asked, Raquel Rodriguez asked, similarly, how do we start this conversation with children? I don't know if you have time to address that very long one.
I'm actually doing a presentation on raising anti-racist children, because that's my area of expertise. And the first thing you do, we have said, is just talk about it. By the age of 3 months old, babies are more likely to prefer a caregiver, prefer others who look like their primary caregiver, like mom, dad, grandma, whoever that primary caregiver is. And then by age 2 and 3, they start looking at physical characteristics of what makes us different, hair texture. They look at shapes of eyes, they look at lips, nose features, because, constantly, children are in our faces, or we're in their faces. And then they start making associations about what that means by what we as adults say about that. Even if we don't explicitly say racist comments, they start to infer what that means. And so what we do in early education is use literature. We use a lot of books. We use play. And the one thing we do is we talk about it. We don't shush a child because he or she is saying something about a person because of their difference, whether it's a person who's ably different or racially different. We talk about that. We talk about this, Beverly Daniel Tatum, who says, why are all the children in the cafeteria? Basically she talks about this, kids being segregated in the cafeteria. So Beverly Tatum Daniel talks about her son Jonathan, saying a young white boy had a theory, preschooler had a theory about his peer. It says, you're brown or you're black because you drank chocolate milk, right? They're trying to figure it out. These are babies. And so trying to help that white child unlearn that theory that their skin is because of the melanin in our skin, and that all of us have it, and then some of us have more than others, and that it was used to protect us from different regions of the world and where we live and from the environment. And the shape of our nose and the shape of our eyes are all a part of that. So I do a whole series of looking at different books on that. Not a series, but at least one training right now that does that. But you talk about race, you do not avoid it. You hit it right on, and you use books to help, children's literature to be your guide in that. Get crayons, Crayola now. Yeah.
Somebody has pointed out that Dr. Kendi has a children's book version for how to be an anti-racist, and it's called Anti-Racist Baby.
Yeah. Also go to an organization called Embrace Race. It's all about children. It's called Embrace Race. And the other website you can go to just focus on children is Raising Race Consciousness for Children, because that's what it's called. And they got all these resource books. They have a little toolkit and protocol that's in English and Spanish. Go there. That will be like a huge start. And they are laser focused on supporting, talking to children about race equity from all cultural backgrounds, not just African American, Black, but all cultural backgrounds.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to say that we're going to wrap up the session now. We are going to make the recording available so that you can watch this again. You can share it with your colleagues who didn't get a chance to come today. Dr. Wesley, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. I think, yet again, extraordinarily well received. People are really delighted with your presentation and really grateful for all that you've shared today. So thank you so much on behalf of the Multicultural Resource Center and our DICP alumni group. We're just really grateful for you for sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome anytime. And I wish you all the best in your work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up now, and we'll provide access to the slides and the recording, so you'll have Dr. Wesley's contact information if you need to reach out for her in the future for either doing this presentation for other groups or working with her in the future. And we will provide the content from the Q&A so that you're able to reference that as well later. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.